How was your weekend? Not good, huh? Anybody do anything fun? Basketball game? Did you guys know that Jim Room was going to be there?
Yeah, I
Oh.
All-Star break. He's been to a lot of the games.
Has he? It was his birthday on Saturday. Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
Well, I guess I can't surprise you with anything.
I don't know any of that.
Bunch of Jimmer stalkers. Yeah, I knew where he was going to be. Because I followed him there. I was going to say something else about the basketball game. I forgot what it was. Jimmer will come up again later. Actually, he's in the lecture. All right, so today we're going to sort of shift gears and talk about perceiving movement and motion perception, specifically visual motion perception. But motion we use in ways other than just for detecting whether something is moving in the environment or not. So motion plays into other aspects of perception. So what I want you to do is take out a piece of paper or the corner of your notes or it's okay if you type this on your computer, you're not going to hand it in or anything. We're going to write for 2 or 3 minutes on this question. In what ways is motion tied to other aspects of visual perception? So what other information does motion give us other than that something is moving in the environment? So what's the point of the question?
Yeah.
What other information does motion give us? So obviously, if you perceive something as moving, then that tells you there's something moving in the environment, right? Which is useful information, particularly if it's moving toward your head, right? But what else does motion tell us? So does motion tie into other aspects? Does motion give us depth or color or other aspects of visual perception? Can we glean that information from motion? How does it tie in? Or does it tie in at all? Or is motion just good for detecting moving things? Is it me or is that thing getting worse? Oh, then I say so. It's magic. So take another minute or so, and then we'll talk about your answers. All right, so what'd you come up with? Justin?
I think like from an evolutionary perspective, it might be how you get all of the cues for like still photos. For example, if something moves away and like gets smaller, as the parallel lines go, then you know that if you ever seen a picture, parallel lines is getting smaller.
Okay, so we're getting depth from motion because if something is close and it moves farther away, you can see that it gets smaller. And so, therefore, we can use that in the future as one of the monocular cues to perceiving depth. So motion helps us to learn these monocular cues. Good. Yeah. Christina?
Maybe what something's made of.
Okay.
Density, like how fast it's moving.
And sort of how quickly it drops, for example. So balloons versus bowling balls are going to drop at different rates. So that tells you something about what they're made out of and how dense they are. Okay. Other ideas? Victoria? Right, but if you can see the sort of the prototypical bird motion, then you can infer what is that from that. So sort of biological motion tells you something about the makeup of the item. And we'll talk about biological motion later on and how if it's just a little bit off, then it looks really weird. So how many of you have seen the movie, the animated version of The Polar Express with Tom Hanks and Tom Hanks and Tom Hanks? And how odd that is, how the biological motion is not quite right. It's sort of this, it's sort of weird. So we do pull a lot of information from biological motion about birds or people's faces and things like that. Good. Other ideas? Christina?
Well, going along with depth, we might have already talked about this, but how fast something's moving in the foreground versus the same thing in the background.
Okay.
Talking about the balls or whatever, you can tell how far away something is based on how fast it's moving.
Yes. Yeah. So does anybody remember what that's called? It's got a great name. Say it louder, Sam. Yes, motion parallax. So the stuff that's closer moves faster than or appears to move faster than the stuff that's far away. So you can get some depth information from motion parallax as well. Yeah. Other ideas? No? That's a pretty good list. There are a couple of other aspects that I'll make you show you some examples about. So we've talked a little bit about depth, shape, shape perception. We didn't talk about color at all. Can we get color from motion? And I'm going to show you an instance where we do, in fact, get some color information from motion. So this is sort of the outline for today. We're going to talk about these other aspects of perception that motion is tied to. Then we're going to talk about differentiating between self-motion and observer motion. So seeing things moving in the environment versus you moving in the environment. The image on your retina is the same. How do you know that you're moving and the environment isn't, or that the environment is moving and you're not, or that you're both moving, for example? We'll talk a little bit about some of the neuronal representation of motion perception, which sort of feeds into that previous point, and then we'll talk about higher order motion processes, such as biological motion. All right, so can we get color out of motion? So what I'd like you to do is fixate on the plus sign. And what do you notice after a while? Anybody see a green dot? Sort of chasing around. So allow your eyes to follow the green dot, and what happens to it? Goes away. But if you fixate again on the plus sign, on the fixation cross, green dot comes back. Sorry? Yes. Yeah. So it's an after image, right? So these are opponent colors. So remember opponent processes and color perception? That's what's going on here, is that as these little purple dots stay, they fatigue your purple receptors. And basically the opposite of that is green. And so this motion allows you to see a green after image. It's not real color perception, right? Because it's an after image, and you're not really perceiving, well, that color isn't actually there in the environment, but no colors are, actually. Josh?
So if those purple dots were just rotating smoothly, would we still see that green dot?
No. So if the dots were moving and there was just a gap in there?
Yeah, if there's the gap, but just like rotating smoothly instead of twitching.
What do you guys think? Would that actually work?
Maybe a little bit, because the purple would still go over some photoreceptors and still fatigue them a little bit, probably less.
Yeah, probably a lot less, because this depends on is as you're fixating here, that this purple dot stays for at least 2 seconds, and then it goes away and then comes back. So you've got that same spot on your photoreceptors, that same receptive field that's being activated by purple, and so that's going to fatigue the purple receptor, the purple processing, and so you're going to get green as the opponent to that. If it was moving, then you wouldn't have that fatigue going on.
Why do some of them sometimes they all disappear then without green showing up?
Ooh, does anybody else get that? So if you fixate long enough, do they all disappear? Why is that? Except for the green. The green is always there.
And then if you like blink, both circles are green circle.
Why would the purple ones disappear just spontaneously? What's that? Yes. Yeah, that's essentially what's going on. So your photoreceptors will respond pretty vigorously at first, but then what happens to them? The response sort of goes down, right? And so this happens with any image. So if you fixate long enough on any image, it'll sort of come and go. Parts of it will. So specifically, if you've got a nice solid background like this, then your brain's basically, these are going to bleach out, and your brain's basically going to fill in and say the whole thing is gray. And so it doesn't have anything to do, that sort of filling in doesn't have anything to do with the photoreceptors, but the photoreceptors are fatiguing.
But then why does the green circle?
Why does the green continue to circle? Because that's changing, actually. So that's a change to your photoreceptors, and your photoreceptors respond to that change still. So the color opponent processing doesn't happen at the level of the photoreceptors. It happens at least one step down the processing chain. And so that's going to continue on, and that's not going to bleach, but the photoreceptors themselves are going to fatigue. They're not going to respond after a while, and they'll sort of fade in and out. So there's a number of things going on with this illusion, which is kind of cool. All right, so we can get a kind of color. It's not real color perception. What about shape? So what shape is that? It's a rectangle, right? Now it's a cylinder. Wait, what have I done? I've made some of them move in one direction, some of them move in another direction, and as you slow down the edges, right? So if they move quickly, so how does a cylinder move? So if you have put a dot on a cylinder around the edges, it's going to move pretty slowly, but in the middle, it's going to move fast. So you're extracting this shape from just the motion. Are these really moving in a cylinder? No, they're moving back and forth across the page. So it's still two-dimensional, but you get this third dimension of depth, either coming out or going back away from you. What direction is the cylinder rotating? Does it change for you? I can never get it to change. It's always moving the same direction for me, though I couldn't tell you right now what direction that is. It's ambiguous enough. We can get depth from motion as well. So this does actually physically get bigger as you look at the phases as they move across the face of the moon, but you also get some depth perception from as the shadows move across the face of the moon. But you don't always get depth. So here's another one of these ambiguous rotation things where I've taken away much of the depth cues. I haven't actually, I didn't make this one up. Whoever put this together has taken away a bunch of the depth cues, and so you can perceive her as rotating either clockwise or counterclockwise. So how many vote for clockwise for the dancer? Counterclockwise? Now she's switched. So how does it switch? What do you think? Well, first, why is it ambiguous? What would help you to be able to determine these things? And then can you make her switch the other way?
Actually switching. Because why would we all perceive it at the exact same time that she switches?
I don't know. That's really interesting.
She's been going this. Oh, there she
I
goes.
can't do
Switch.
the switch.
I can't make her switch either. Although spontaneously it'll switch for me, but I can't like concentrate on something. So what depth cues, what monocular depth cues have I taken away that would help?
Her, she's just black. There's no like shadow to her body.
Okay, so there's no shadow, like with the previous one with the moon, where if you had the shadow going around across it, then you could see the depth. Okay, so there's no shadows. What else is she lacking? Justin?
There's no occlusion from one side to the other, so you can't tell which way like the leg is facing.
Right, exactly. So if you look at her right hand as it's coming around there, did that just go behind her or in front of her? You don't have the occlusion. So if you had the occlusion of her body, then you can say, oh, her hand is behind her now. But equally likely in this scenario with the silhouette is that it's in front of her. So you don't know what's occluding what.
I can get her to switch if I look at the right hand. I can get her to switch directions.
So imagine it being occluded versus not. Okay. Notice what's going on with her height as well. She doesn't stay at the same spot. She goes up and down. Why would that matter? To be distracted. No, it actually does matter because so if you look at her what is this? Her left foot goes up and down a bit, but notice what happens to her right foot. It stays on the same level the whole time. If it didn't stay on the same level, what information would that give you? Would that tell you anything about depth? Yeah, because height in the picture plane is important, right? So the closer it is, the lower it should be. But since it's all staying at the same level, you can't use that cue as information. Anything else that is missing? That's all that I can think of. So there's no occlusion, there's no shading, there's no height in the picture plane. All of which would help you and all of which would normally be there. All right, so motion gives you all sorts of information about these things, about depth, about color, about distance, and things like that. So how do we actually perceive motion? I've got a list of 5. There may be more than this, but this is what I came up with. So there are 5 ways that I can get you to perceive motion. One is if something is actually moving, real movement in the environment. Another is apparent movement. You can have induced movement, motion after effect, and a movement illusion in static stimuli. All of these are going to basically activate motion-sensitive neurons in your brain, and specifically in area MT is where we're going to be most interested. MT stands for middle temporal. Which is in extrastriate visual cortex, also sometimes known as V5, V4/V5. So it receives motion information. All right, so let me show you examples of all of these things so that you get some idea of what they're on about. So this is not really real movement. This is the best approximation that I can give you for real movement in a PowerPoint. So real movement would be this, me actually moving. So that's real movement. What is it really with the PowerPoint?
Apparent?
It's apparent movement. Why is it apparent movement?
Well, because it looks like the same ball is moving, but it's really like several different pictures just turning on and off.
Right, exactly. It's like any other movie where you've got a series of still photos. If we move them fast enough, faster than, 60 frames per second or something like that, then you have the illusion of movement. So another example of apparent movement is here where we take it away, but it looks like it's the same ball that's just moving back and forth between these two spots, right? So here we've made the apparent movement obvious. And it could be two different balls that are just appearing in two different locations. Or the more parsimonious explanation is one ball that's moving back and forth between these two things. So apparent movement is what the movies take advantage of. That's why they're called movies, right? So if you think about the source of that word, that it's because you've got a bunch of still photos that you string them all together and it looks like you've got movement going on. How many of you have ever made a flip book in the corner of your notebook? Of the little, like a little car or something going along, and then something falling on it and crash, and there's big explosions, and then like the last page of your notebook is taken up by the enormity of the explosion. Anybody do that? Is that just me? So that's all apparent movement, right? So we've known about this for a good long time, that you can induce a perception of movement from static images, from still images, if you present them fast enough. All right, what about induced movement? So if you are watching Jimmer, is that Jimmer?
Yeah, sure.
All right. What happens specifically here? What happens to the red dot? Does it move? Does it appear to move? Yeah, so this is induced movement. The dot doesn't actually move. The dot stays at the exact same place during the whole clip, but if we play it again, you'll see that, relative to the background, it looks like it's moving quite a lot. And that's sort of the point, is that relative to something else, it appears to move. Here's another example of induced movement. Not quite as dramatic, but it looks like the moon is racing through the clouds, when in fact it's the opposite that's happening, right? The clouds are moving and the moon is staying relatively in the same spot. So you get this induced movement because of sort of this lack of visual information. There's this great paper by a guy named Harvey Fletcher where he talks about induced movement. So does that name sound familiar, Harvey Fletcher? Why does that sound familiar?
He was the homecoming founder last year.
Who's the founder of Homecoming?
Well, like they have this thing where instead of homecoming queen, they like honor a person.
Some dead guy?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. So there's also a building on campus named the Harvey Fletcher Building. If you listened to Devotional 2 or 3 weeks ago, it was the grandson of Harvey Fletcher who was talking, and he was talking about Harvey Fletcher. This grandson is a professor here at BYU. So Harvey Fletcher has quite a long history at BYU. He's got this paper where he was here in Provo looking at, I think it was a campfire up on Y Mountain, or some lights up on Y Mountain. And without any context, so as he was outside in his backyard, it was completely dark, it looked like as he was moving, the campfire moves a lot. Is that likely to happen, that the campfire moves around? No. But as soon as he went inside and he had sort of the context of the window, the campfire stayed the same. But if you go back outside, then the campfire moves around again. So if you lack these contextual details, if you lack a context to place this against, then it appears to move, if it's completely dark all around it. This happens with newer Toyota Corollas, I've noticed. So I rented a Toyota Corolla, a couple of years ago. And the dash, does anybody drive a Corolla? A newish one? Do you have no? So mine's a 99. So the newer ones have these bright dials, bright white dials. Is yours like this? So when it's completely dark outside, so as you're driving like out of the city, like in complete darkness, do the dials appear to move around at all?
Yeah.
Okay. So as you're looking straight ahead, you don't have any context around these dials because they're bright white, everything else is black in the car. And so they appear to sort of move around until you look at them, and then they stay fixed because then you've got sort of the context of the steering wheel and stuff. But then as you look away, you lose those details, and they move around a bit more. All right, so that's all induced motion. It's just relative to the context, you see motion. So relative to the clouds or relative to the lack of anything, you're going to perceive it as moving. Motion after effect is where you look at a stimulus that's moving in a certain direction. We've actually messed around with this a little bit before. And you're basically, so it basically takes the same strategy as the color after effect, right? So you've got motion-sensitive neurons, and they're set up in opponent processes. So if you fatigue the motion-sensitive neurons that are sensitive to direct motion in this direction, then when you take that motion away, the opponent process is going to take over, and you're going to perceive motion in the opposite direction. So let me show you an example. All right, so look in the middle. Right about there. Does this go? Okay, now look at the back of your hand or your neighbor's face. It's bizarre, isn't it? Can we stop it? Oh, look, you can do it on your iPhone. How fun is that? Oh, I haven't seen any of these other ones. Do I dare? Yes? Oh, this isn't any good. I want illusions. This is just fun. Yeah, that is kind of lame. All right. So this is the website. So what are other examples of this motion after effect? Like real life examples. Have you ever experienced this? Ellen?
Does it ever happen when you're like in a wave pool and then you get out and you feel like you're still like in it? Or is this kind of
That's a little bit different. So you're sort of acclimatizing to the actual motion and you getting moved around. So it's like if you're on a boat for a long time, you get back on solid ground and you feel like solid ground is sort of rocking back and forth. So that's a little bit different. That's still motion perception, but it's more of vestibular motion perception. So your body feeling the motion and getting used to that rocking motion. Then you get out and you're not anymore. So it's the same sort of principle, just a different system that's being organized. Christian?
That thing that's in like all the haunted houses, you're like walking down the tunnel, it's spinning.
Yeah, so you feel like you should be tipping over.
Yeah, and then when you get out, you still are like.
Yeah, you still feel like you should be compensating for that, the other direction, though. Yeah.
It's like we talked about with the, like, you're riding on a bus. You're so used to it that when it stops, it just, like, all flies backwards.
Right, exactly. So you're riding on a bus, you're used to the countryside moving past in one direction, you stop at a stoplight, and it feels like it's all moving the opposite direction. Yeah. Anybody ever play Guitar Hero? Do you ever get this at the end of Guitar Hero, where you're used to seeing these things come down, 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 and then it stops, and it feels like they're moving back up the opposite direction? Does anybody else ever get this, or am I the only one who's ever played too much Guitar Hero? Yeah, I don't have any idea. I got this off of the interwebs. Yeah, so this happens all the time. It's also known as the waterfall illusion because that was originally how it was sort of demonstrated, or the original demonstration was somebody looking at a waterfall, watching the motion all go in the same direction, and then if you look off to the side at the rocks, it looks like the rocks are going the opposite direction. So you get used to movement in one direction, you fatigue those motion-sensitive neurons, then you look away and the opponent process takes over and you perceive motion in the opposite direction. So motion after effect. Anybody see these things rotating? This one is usually pretty powerful. So it's a static image, right? So as you look around at the image, you know that it's not really moving, but out of the corner of your eye, you still see motion. And there are a couple of things going on here, manipulating things like light source and lines that are giving you the illusion of motion, even though there's not actually any motion present. All right, so why do we need to perceive motion? What's the point of motion perception? Save your life? How so? Okay. So if it's moving straight at your head, for example, that's kind of useful information, right? You kind of want to know when you need to duck. At what point should you duck? Before it hits your head. So how do you know how close it is to your head, though?
This part of that motion parallax where it seems moving faster as it's getting closer to you?
Right, exactly. So as things are very, very far away and they get closer to you, how rapidly do they get bigger? Yeah, it's exponential, right? So it's very slow at first. So if something is a mile away from you versus half a mile away from you, that difference in size is not going to change that much, right? But as it gets within 2 feet versus 1 foot, what happens to the size? So everybody do this. So your hand out at arm's length versus right here, how much bigger does it get? How much bigger does the image get? So if you pay attention to what it's occluding behind your hand versus what it's occluding here, it's pretty big, right? So this is called looming. That as things get closer to your head, as they get closer to your eyes more properly, that the size of the object on your retina grows exponentially. So as something grows like that, you're going to have a startle reflex, right? You're going to want to move pretty quickly. So it's been demonstrated in things like house flies that this is what they're paying attention to. They don't know that that's your hand coming at them to swat them. All they know is that something is looming in their visual field, and so they'll fly. And they have it's basically just a reflex. If you have any image, so even if it's not getting any closer to the fly, if you have like a video display above the fly and you have something loom on that, the fly will take off. Versus if you have something just growing slightly larger, it won't take off. It's cued into that looming, because what does that mean for a fly? If something is looming, it's going to squash it, right? And it's going to get much closer, much faster. So motion perception allows us to survive. It keeps us safe from predators, for example, or from rolled up newspapers that are about to squish us. Predators use the movement of prey as a primary means of locating and hunting. So there's sort of a trade-off here, right? So what photoreceptors are cued into motion? Rods or cones? Rods. So in predators, they've got a predominance of rods at the sacrifice of cones. So they have great motion perception, poor color perception. So you can be outlandishly colored as long as you're not moving, you'll be safe, right? Probably helps if you're colored the same color as well. So the prey must be able to gauge the movement of predators to avoid them. Certain kinds of movements trigger reflective action, so that's the looming for flies triggers this reflexive actions. So if you are a rat, what's your best defense against owls and cats and other predators? Staying still. Yeah, so this is actually a good behavioral measurement of fear in rats. So if you're doing fear conditioning with rats, you want to know, is the rat afraid? Well, just measure how long it freezes. So rats have this instinctive behavior where they'll freeze when they get in new situations. They'll just stop moving. And if nobody eats them, then they'll start moving again after a little while. So depending on how afraid it is, the longer it'll stay frozen. All right, other functions of motion perception. Motion aids in perceiving objects, so being able to see things moving against the background. The movement of objects helps you to organize stimuli. So let me pull up an example of this. I didn't do it right. H-A-E-L. Oh no. That's not what I wanted. Shoot, I'm trying to pull up this website and it's not working. Here we go. Incidentally, this is a great website for visual illusions. I think it's linked on the syllabus. So, does anybody see a bird in there? How about now? So if we take away the noise, you can see the bird, obviously. Now if we stop the bird, there he is. You can still sort of see where it is. Now you can definitely see it. But here it blends into its background. It's great camouflage, right? So you can't use any of the physical characteristics of the bird to see it, but as soon as it starts moving, it all gets organized together. So which Gestalt principle is this? Motion, yes. It had a specific name. Do you remember it? The law of... All good guesses. Common fate. So this line configuration, these lines that are sort of moving together, all get grouped together perceptually, right? So the other lines are not moving, they get segregated away, but the lines associated with the bird are all moving together, they all share a common fate. So again, if we stop the bird, it still disappears. Still blends into the background. And as soon as it starts moving, then you can perceive it. All right, so if you're a predator hunting for this bird, then a good strategy for the bird is to either hold really still if you're right next to it, or fly away so you can't get it. What is that supposed to be? Oh.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's like it. Yeah, okay, I see that. And now it's a little gopher thing. are great. Oh, this one takes a while.
Is that like the staircase in Inception?
Yes. How does it do that? How does it do that?
If you look at an explanation of it, it'll show that waterfall from the side. It kind of makes a little more sense. That's not one contiguous framework right there.
Well, of course it's not. But how do they get the water to do? I don't know. That's pretty cool. So I would recommend checking out this site in more detail later on. Loads of fun illusions on there. The motion one, though, still holds. So it's this bird demonstration. So the idea is that as the bird starts to move, law of common fate says that the bits of the bird all stick together and you can perceive the bird, but then as soon as it stops moving against the background, it goes away. There's a great scene from Ocean's 12, 13, 14. Which one is that? With the French guy in the
13.
Is it 13? So he's standing against a stained glass window. You don't see him, although he's in plain sight the whole time. If you rewind it and watch, you can see him right there. You just don't notice him because he sort of blends into the background. And then he walks out and takes the diamonds or whatever, and then jumps off the building in this outlandish jumpsuit. So another great example of if you're not really looking for it, you don't really notice it. All right. What happens if you damage area MT? So we've been talking about this brain region that's sensitive to motion. So presumably, if you can damage it, right, and lose motion perception. It turns out that this is in fact the case, that it happens in some small proportion of people. So you can acquire a motion agnosia. So an inability to perceive motion. And so what is this like? It's like everything is under a strobe light. So you can see still images, you just don't see things transitioning. So this is a problem in everyday life, right? So what sort of activities would be impeded by this? Walking on the street, okay. So you try and cross the street, and you look for, what are you looking for when you go to cross the street? Moving cars, right. So if you can't perceive the cars moving, you don't know if that car is just double parked, or is it actually coming toward you until it's right there in front of you, and so you're a little bit out of luck, right? So you can't see the moving cars. So that's a big obvious one. What are some smaller, more subtle things that you can think of that would be hard if you didn't have motion perception?
Writing? Like watch what you're writing with your fingers and stuff?
Drinking, pouring a cup. So 1 second the cup is, your glass of water is empty. The next second it's overflowing. So you don't see that smooth motion of the glass filling up, for example. Writing, you'd be unable to perceive. Yeah, so you'd have to have you wouldn't have any visual feedback really, or you'd have limited visual feedback. So your handwriting might suffer. Other questions or other aspects that would be impeded, Victoria?
Is the movement of their eyes impeded, like in reading, or can they, is that
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. My guess is no, because it feels like your eyes move smoothly across the page. But in fact, if you ever watch someone while they're reading, do this to really creep somebody out sometime. Sort of sneak up to the side of them as they're reading and watch what their eyes do. They don't move smoothly across the page. You make saccades, you make jumps. And so you get sort of a series of still images that way anyhow. So I think that their reading would probably be the same. They may not have the perception of smooth movement, but their eyes would still be doing the same thing. And I think they'd still get the same information.
I'm wondering, like, in that video, like, miss, like, 1 second from looking
Yeah, I think that this may be sort of exaggerated just to give you a feel for what it's like. But it might be accurate as well. I've never had motion agnosia, so I couldn't tell you. And I've never actually known of anyone with motion agnosia. I've read about it, but I've never actually seen any of these patients. So it's sort of an open question. So they may, you're making about 3 saccades a second. So they may miss 2 of those saccades. So it could be that they're going to miss some of those fixations as they're reading. Yeah, and I don't know specifically, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know sort of how long are the blanks in between. My guess is that it's probably pretty idiosyncratic, that sometimes they're pretty short, sometimes they're pretty long. So it just depends on how much information they have to process. All right. Do we want to, well, let's introduce this. We've got a little bit of time. So this is going to be something to think about before class on Wednesday. So in what circumstances do we actually perceive motion? There's sort of 3 possible scenarios, right? One possible scenario is that something actually moves. You stay still, your eyes stay still, and something moves across your visual field. That's this first one, right? So an object moves, the observer is stationary. The movement creates an image that moves on the observer's retina. So usually you perceive that as the object moving, everything else is staying stationary, right? The second situation is an object moves and the observer follows the object with his or her eyes. So ball goes across the screen, you track, or ball flies across the room, you track the ball as it moves, from Jimmer's hand to bounce off the backboard. And he misses. I just say that to check if you're listening. All right, so what do you perceive? Well, the image of the ball, it stays the same on your retina, right? Because you're tracking the ball as it progresses. But you still perceive the ball as moving because the rest of the scene moves. So the image for the rest of the scene does move across your retina, even though the image of the ball stays the same. So that's situation number 2. Situation number 3 is that the observer moves through a stationary environment. The whole image appears to move on your retina, but you don't perceive anything as moving. You perceive the whole room as staying stationary because you know that you yourself are moving. So these are sort of the 3 situations. 1, the image changes on the retina. 2, the image doesn't change on the retina, but you still perceive motion. And 3, everything changes on the retina, the whole image does, but you don't perceive motion.
Do you have an example of the third one?
So I've got sort of cheesy pictures. So the third one is just what's a good example of this? It's that star field screensaver where the stars are sort of moving past you. You don't perceive them as actually moving. You feel like you're moving through space, right? So just anytime you're walking through the environment, so if you got up and walked out the door, you wouldn't perceive the door as moving toward you, right? You know that you're moving toward the door. The door stays stationary, but its image changes as you're moving toward it. So the image on your retina is changing completely. So the question is, how do we know this? How do we compute these things? So in some instances, the image on your retina is changing. In other instances, it's not. How do you know that it's you moving and not the rest of the world? So how can we create an illusion that gives you the illusion of motion, like the star field screensaver? All right, we'll pick up there on Wednesday and come up with a solution for that.